Hey, what's going on, everybody? My name is Corey, better known as the Seaman, and I want to welcome you to a very spooky edition of the Seaman's Cinema Sitdown. That's right, folks. I went and peeped a horror film last night that got me unbelievably unnerved. It took a while before I could go to sleep, and a few cartoons. This movie creeped me out. The question is, did it creep me out in a good way or a bad way? In order to find out, you know what you gotta do. Pull up a chair, take a seat. Right now, we are going in spoiler-free discussion time on Hereditary. Now, here's a movie, man, that cleaned up at Sundance, I believe. Real big buzz coming out of Sundance. It is getting a ton of buzz and a lot of love from reviewers. Before we find out what this reviewer thought of this flick, let's get into the basics of it. This movie is coming to us from director and writer Ari Aster. Aster has only done short films, both in his writing and directing, so this is his first full-length feature go, and he does some really good things. But I think this movie maybe got away from him a little bit. I want to be in line with a lot of the great things that people are saying about this movie, but the third act did something that just didn't work well for me. And we're going to dive into all of that. But for those unfamiliar with the plot, the plot of Hereditary follows this family led by Toni Collette, who plays Annie, the mother in the family. Her mother dies, so we start at the funeral, and it's kind of her working through all of her stuff, in grief counseling and stuff like that, kind of working through all of this stuff when another family tragedy happens. After the second tragedy happens, things are kind of presented to Annie that lead us into a more ghost film. There's some seances, and from there, the creepy level just dials up and dials up and dials up and dials up, and the uncomfortability dials up and dials up and dials up until we go on this wild ride to the end. And if the end works for you, then you're going to love this movie. If the end doesn't work for you, you're going to be sitting in the place I am, where I'm a little disappointed. So, because of that, we're going to do things differently here on the old Sit-Down. I'm actually going to start with the good and end with the bad, because it's the only way to really talk about this movie correctly is to talk about it chronologically. So first off, let's start with all of the really good things that Ari Aster does, because I've heard a few people say, this is one of those films that pushes the envelope, right? And when you're in those situations, both in horror or in sexually driven movies, things like the 50 Shades movies, you're always pushing that line. And sometimes, if you push too far, the movie kind of goes toward a trashy place. I've heard a couple people say that. I don't think that's entirely fair. The first 2/3 of this movie I thought were executed fairly well. Even though I started to see the seeds of where it was going as a horror junkie and a movie junkie, I was starting to pick up on things that made me go, oh no. And I'm familiar with the production house A24, and I was going, oh no, you're gonna go where I don't want you to go right now. But before all that happens, I thought that Ari Aster did a really, really good job building a very, very intricate, compelling family drama. Let's start with the technical spots in this, because style-wise, this movie is superb, start to finish. No matter how you feel about the content at the end of the movie, what you are watching is really, really crafted and well executed. I love the way the camera work. The camera work in this movie is phenomenal. It does some things that you don't quite see all the time. The one thing that I really love the camera doing is a lot of times it'll be following our characters, whoever it may be, into different places, and they see something that is clearly horrifying or troubling. And before we can see it, the camera kind of spins and comes in on their faces and just kind of sits for a while. And it's one of those things, you get to see that reaction, right? It's the... and you get that, but then the camera stays. And sometimes it stays like 30, 40 seconds, man, just on the face, so you're getting just all of the emotional and facial reactions to whatever they're seeing, which unnerves, at least unnerved me to no end, because it's like, oh man, I don't like the way you're looking at that. What are you gonna show me? You know, and you're getting all kind of like, throughout the whole movie. And that also really, really executed well. If you wanted to go and feel uncomfortable for 2 hours, Ari Aster nails that, that's for sure. I also love his point of view camera shots. There's a couple times where the camera switches to the point of view of the character, and all of those work well, where they pop up. It's kind of a nice change of pace to what we're watching. Really like when Ari Aster does that stuff. He has this really, really unique exterior transition. It's a stagnant shot of the house that, in a frame, one frame to the next frame, goes from daytime to nighttime. I've seen plenty of those, like time elapse transitions, right, where we see the sky go from light to dark, but in a single frame to go from bright blue to black, or black to bright blue. Just very clever. I thought it looked really, really nice, and for whatever reason, maybe because it's something I wasn't expecting or not used to seeing, again, made me really it was really unsettling every time it happened. I was like, oh man, where are we going now? And the film does a really good job of making you feel that start to finish. Like I said, no matter how you end up where you fall after the first 2/3, it does make you uneasy, and you are creeped out most of this movie. It's a very little jump scare. I was a few times ready for jump scares, and they don't really happen. This is really, really a more psychological horror film, although it does not pull any punches in trying to direct you away from not seeing all the stuff. There's some really disturbing imagery in this movie that works really well, that you do get to see. And it's, that stuff works, and then there's other stuff that you don't see, and then you're like, man, if I'm not seeing that, and I've seen some of this, how bad is it? But all of that stuff works really well. There's also this really awesome shot where we're seeing Toni Collette's Annie appear to be walking on the ceiling, and then the camera kind of follows her from behind and flips itself right side up, but in reality she's actually walking on the ground. There's this cool kind of motion for the camera. So like I said, Ari Aster does a lot of technically sound, very well crafted stylistic things in this movie, and if you're just talking about style, this movie is superb in that department. But where most movies live and die, it's the writing. And for me, the first 2/3 of this film, really, really strong. Like I said, it really created a very compelling, twisted family story. When the second tragedy happens, and because it's a non-spoiler, I won't give anything away, but when that happens, the place that this family has to go, and the places that Toni Collette's character goes, just really develop in the first act of this movie this really compelling family story that's twisted and creepy and at times hysterical. But no matter what side you're sitting on, whether it's Toni Collette's Annie's point of view, whether it's her son Peter's point of view, whether it's her husband played by Gabrielle Byrne's Steve, his point of view, anytime you're totally understanding where those characters are coming from. Peter, played by Alex Wolff, has a very different reaction to some things than Toni Collette's character. And Toni Collette goes a little bit more hysterical than her co-stars sometimes in these outbursts that she has. But every time they happen in the first act, you're like, okay, that was maybe pushing it a little too far, but it's not totally unfair either. And it did. It allowed for this really compelling drama to start to unfold. And the cool thing too in that first act is a lot of that uneasiness is spawned from an unbelievable score. The score in this film, it just amplifies the creepiness and eeriness like tenfold. The score is brilliant. But on top of that, the first act really spawns a lot of its uneasiness from like things that feel very real. Family loss, tragedy. We learn that Toni Collette's family has a little bit of mental illness. So there's this question of, is everything that's happening with her really happening on screen, or is it not? Because we know that her family, and the movie's name is Hereditary, that her family has, mental illness issues. And during one of her grief counseling scenes where she goes to kind of like an AA, but for grief counseling, she kind of starts talking and just kind of goes like verbal diarrhea and just starts going and going and going into everything and kind of lays out things that happen to her family. And you see, like, oh man, mental illness might be a trend. This movie's called Hereditary. Maybe that's a trend with Toni Collette and why she's so crazy. The lack of communication, brings up these really compelling conversations amongst the family. And I really thought that the first act was giving us a really interesting look into the way people handle grief or handle shock. The second tragedy is shock, and it gives us, some really like gut-wrenching emotional pulls. And you can, like I said, you're able to understand where everybody's coming from. Even though some of them make you go, why aren't you doing what you should be doing? But when you think about the shock end of it, like I said, very interesting ways for all these people to respond to this one instance that happens in the first act. And then from there, the second act, we kind of start to go more into a ghost movie. There's a couple seance scenes, and that stuff works really well, man. Like, I'm sitting there and I'm like, oh man, this is like, take me back to like Sinister or, Insidious, where I'm like Ghost Story, like, oh man, like, and really, really well crafted stuff that still was working with what was developed in the first act, right? It was, for me, amplifying the fact that, like, oh man, as things are getting crazier and crazier, is Toni Collette actually losing her mind? And I'm like, we're 2 acts in, I'm like, we are really going someplace interesting in this film, and like the merging of a ghost story with a psychological, maybe, mental crazy story mixed in with this really interesting family drama. I was like, man, we are really adding a lot of cool ingredients into this film, and it was working superbly. And then the third act happened, and we will get there. But before we get there, we got to talk about how great the acting start to finish in this movie is. It starts, for me, with the lead, Toni Collette, who, for me, after watching this, she deserves an Oscar nod. Her performance is gripping and just unreal. She's phenomenal and totally worth, any kind of nomination come, award season. I'll be very interested to see if she does or doesn't, and if she doesn't, is that an impact because of the third act? And it's because of where we go, and it wasn't put out there on Front Street. It's kind of a twist that like makes you go, oh, I've been duped into something that I'm not digging. And I'll be really interested to see if she doesn't get nominated. I think it could be because of the material by the end of the movie and where it goes. But the emotional roller coaster that Collette's Annie goes through in this movie is unbelievable. Like I said, dealing with the loss of her mother first, and then the second tragedy. When the second tragedy happens, Toni Collette, man, just makes you want to, like, just hug her or do something to make her stop. She goes into a guttural, hysterical scream that transitions us from one scene into a second scene where she's still kind of crying and screaming. And it was so cool the way to transition it that way. And the guttural scream, man, it hits you to your core, and you're just like, oh my god, this woman. Like, you just feel so hard for her, man. Her facial expressions throughout the movie are phenomenal, man. She really just gives you all of her emotion on her face. She could, it's one of those, like, she's got a bad poker face. You can tell all of the emotion that she's got going on right from the very get-go. And I absolutely love everything she's doing because it feels so real, even when it borders hysterical. And it's just, she walks that line so well throughout the whole movie. And she gets put through the ringer, man. I mean, every emotional turn you think you could get, they throw at Toni Collette, and you get to see all of it play out on her face. And it worked so well. And because of the things that we find out about her family history, there is a good stretch where we're kind of wondering, like, all right, how much of this maybe is possibly in Toni Collette's head? And all of that. It's just, her acting is just bar none phenomenal. After that, Alex Wolff, who plays her son Peter, man, the first time I had ever seen him was in Jumanji: Welcome to the Jungle. He plays the high school version of the Rock's character, and Oh man, I mean, really liked him there. We get a very, very different, non-fun version of Alex Wolff in this one, and he is phenomenal, man. Again, very much like Annie, Toni Collette's Annie, Peter goes through a crazy emotional roller coaster that's very drastically different from what Annie goes through. And same thing, man. All of his facial reactions, the acting is just all funneled right in here, and the camera lives right in there a lot. You know, and you know, his hysterics also just work really well. He makes you uneasy a lot as things start happening to him, and just everything that Alex Wolff does in this movie is just phenomenal, man. I mean, like I said, delivers amazingly unsettling sequences. You know, he's semi-involved in what's going on in the first act that leads to one of the big tragic events, and the way he responds to that event, so different than the way Annie responds, but again, I could totally understand why. Not something I would have done, but like you can totally get like that, the way you handle shock, the way he does, it's really superb. And then the physical acting for him, he kind of has more physical acting and what he kind of throws his body or contorts his body into, and all of that is just phenomenal. I think he too probably deserves to be in these early Oscar nomination talks for supporting actor, because man, Alex Wolff really, same thing, just poured everything he had into that role. And like I said, no matter where we end up in the movie, he is stellar throughout. Millie Shapiro, who plays Charlie, she has been the focal point in all of the previews. We see her everywhere. It's the younger sister in the movie. And, man, she is the winner for unsettling, man. I could not figure out what her deal was. And every time she's on screen, I'm just like, oh, what is gonna happen? You know, anything that's going on with her character, you were just always like, oh, dude. And like, I felt bad about it, because, like, it seems like maybe there's some sort of an issue there, you know, genetically, or, you know, I can't tell, like, is she, like, is supposed to be Down syndrome, or is her face just weird? But it all leads to this kind of a loner character that gets put into situations that anywhere she is, man, you're just like, what is happening? And she makes you go, what is going on with her, man? There's times where like, things happen, you're like, did you make that happen? She's fantastic, man. The creepiness level on Charlie is through the roofs. Millie Shapiro really, really nailed it. Then Gabriel Byrne, who plays the husband Steve, really liked him. He was a nice surprise. I missed him in the trailers. I did not pick up that he was in the movie, and then he comes on screen. I'm like, is that Gabriel Byrne? Sure enough, it was. And getting to see him play like the straight dad character, he pulled it off really well. Same thing, his emotional journey is totally different and less expressive than, you know, Toni Collette and Alex Wolff's. But what he does and brings a third element into this really works in the movie. You know, I felt like maybe he was a little underutilized, but every time he pops up, you know, Gabriel Byrne is really, really well, really, really good. And then Ann Dowd plays a character named Joan, who Annie meets at grief counseling, and Ann Dowd does a phenomenal job. She's great. She plays her role to a T. The thing that doesn't work for me with her character is she, you know, gets introduced in the second act and kind of is the person who, you know, she's also kind of dealing with loss and kind of pulls Annie into like, hey, like, I just tried this thing and this thing happened and it totally changed me. You should try this thing. And that kind of launches us into the ghost story. But like I said, as a horror fan and a horror junkie, I started to see the seeds, man, and there were things that kept popping up in the movie sporadically in the first two acts. And every time it popped up, I'm like, why is this here? And the more it popped up, I was like, oh no. I know A24 movies. This is starting to feel like another A24 movie. And if they go there, I don't know, man, because you didn't put it out on Front Street. One of my favorite A24 movies is The Witch. One of the best psychological, visually terrifying movies I've ever seen. That dialed up uncomfortability to like a maximum for me. And it dealt with the occult, you know, subject matter that, you know, it can turn a lot of people away, but it was very upfront. I knew going into that movie that we were going to be dealing with the occult. This movie does not put that on Front Street. And And when we start diving into occult things in the third act, you lost me. For me, that's where it goes, and it all kind of starts with Joan, Ann Dowd's character. And like I said, I love Ann Dowd, but her character I hate so much because she is essentially the piece that if you removed it and you changed the story to work without her, I think we get something way better than we do. So let's dive into now the bad. And that's the third act of this movie, man. I didn't like where it went. I thought we were really developing this compelling family horror movie, and then all of a sudden we get to the end. It's still a horrific family drama. Circumstantially, what's going on? It's all connected to the family, but it was a turn that I just didn't feel was necessary. I didn't think we had to go to that place, and the fact that it wasn't broadcast on Front Street and it kind of came out of nowhere. I mean, look, and the third act is unbelievably unsettling. It will stay with you. You will not be able to leave that back in the movie theater when you walk out. And for what it was, executed well, for the stuff that they do in the third act. And like I said, it's a non-spoiler, so I won't really dive into it. Maybe I'll do a spoiler review so we can really talk about where this movie went wrong for me. But that diverting from the ghost story to go into an occult story, it didn't work for me. It made me uncomfortable, and I wasn't mentally prepared to be that uncomfortable. And like I said, it's unsettling, and if that's what you're going for, I can see why so many people are goo goo gaga over this movie. But for me, by the time we got to that part, we started going into danger territory as far as pushing the line. Especially because what's delivered to me in the first two acts, totally different than the third act. And it was delivering something I thought that was much more compelling than what the story ended up being. It's hard to kind of go into any more detail without blowing the whole thing up. I've kind of maybe given away too much already. So we won't say anything else other than the ending of this movie left a bitter taste and a disappointing taste in my mouth. And overall, it makes the movie not work for me. As great as the first 2/3 of this movie are, the first two acts of this movie are, as much praise as I just gave them for 15 minutes, it's kind of all undone for me because of how this movie ends. So take that as you will. Like I said, the ending is very unsettling. It's hard to watch at times. It makes you go and like hide your eyes, if you're one of those. Everything in there is like horror amplified, turned up to like 1,000. And, I guess it works in that sense, but for me, the story just goes out the window by the time you get to there. Because once you get to there, it's like all the compelling stuff you were doing is now lost. So that's me, man. That's my thoughts on Hereditary. I was, for 2/3 of this movie, I was like, this is going to be an A, maybe an A+. And now I'm more in like the C+, B- range. The third act really killed this movie for me. Made me very disappointed. So, for the first time, the C-Man Cinema Sit-Down is going to end on a poor note. I do still encourage you to go see this movie. I would love to hear your thoughts. As the C-Man's hit the end of his, so please hit those comments if you have seen the movie. Let me know what you thought. Did the third act work for you, or did it go too far to a place that I didn't think we had to go to? Did you agree with me? Did you disagree with me? I totally understand anyone that does. Like I said, I'm a hardcore horror junkie, and stuff in the third act worked really well. It just felt misplaced, and I didn't think it had to go there to pull off this movie to be something really, really cool. So did you feel like you got duped, misled into something that you were like, oh, crap, this is what we're watching? I don't know. If you haven't seen the movie, please go see it anyway. Like I said, the acting in this movie is phenomenal, man. Toni Collette and Alex Wolff deserve your support because what they do in the film is phenomenal. And I'd like to have discussion, man. I'd like to hear what more people think about this movie, because this movie is definitely divisive because of that third act. And I'll be very interested to see, and even some things that happen in the first two acts, I could see some people thinking it was distasteful or, oh, how could you go there? But all of that worked for me. The third just kind of went off the rails. So hit those comments, let me know. If you are new here, please hit the subscribe button and the little bell so you get alerts every time I make a new video. And, hey man, that's it. Not the most exciting way to end a film, movie review. It's very rare that this happens. But that's it. That's all the C-Man's got. So for the C-Man's Cinema Sit Down, I am the C-Man. And I am, sadly, signing off. Peace!